What about Esther? Right, Madonna? What about Esther? Since you go by Esther now. Looking at yet another text by our own Carol Myers as general editor, Women in Scripture. What can we say about Esther? The heroine of the book, named for her. Esther is a young Jewish woman living in exile in the Persian diaspora, the dispersion of the Jewish people, who, through her youth and beauty, becomes queen of the Persian Empire. Then, by her wits and courage, saves the Jewish people from destruction. The message of the book of Esther, which is called here a work of historical fiction, written in the diaspora in the late Persian, early Hellenistic period. Is it historical fiction? Already we have an issue. Of course, the traditional view of the text is that it's not just fiction, it really happened. But the majority of scholarship does look at it as historical fiction. You be the judge, dive into this, it's an issue. It gives encouragement to the exiled Jews that they, though powerless in Persia, can, by their resourcefulness, survive and prosper. Esther first appears in the story as one of the young virgins called into the king's harem as a possible replacement for one Vashti, who was the banished wife of the king called Ahasuerus in Hebrew. Historically, he would be identified as King or Emperor Xerxes the First, in the 400s BCE, the 5th century. So, Esther appears as a replacement for Vashti. She's the cousin, adopted daughter of one Mordecai from the tribe of Benjamin. We don't know much about her character, but she's called beautiful. She's obedient, which is interesting at the outset, appears to be pliant, cooperative, gains favor with the chief eunuch. And when her turn comes to spend the night with the king, Ahasuerus falls in love with her. Well, we have romantic love again in the Bible. This time, the Persian king falls in love with this nice Jewish girl, makes her his queen. But Esther keeps her Jewish identity secret. After Esther becomes queen, her cousin Mordecai becomes involved in a power struggle with the Grand Vizier Haman the Agagite, descendant of an Amalekite king who is an enemy of Israel. Mordecai refuses to bow before Haman, and that makes him so angry he resolves not only to put Mordecai to death, but also to slaughter his entire people. This is ancient genocide. Prefigures the Holocaust, on a literary level anyway. He secures the king's permission to do this. They set a date, Adar the 13th. That's the month of Adar, and that also is the date now in tradition for the festival of Purim. When Mordecai learns of Haman's plot, he goes to the palace to inform Esther, weeping, clothed in sackcloth. But at this point exactly, Esther comes to the fore. Suddenly she's got narrative power in this story. She first learns of Haman's plot and the threat to the Jews, and her reaction is one of helplessness. She can't approach the king without being summoned. Those are the rules. It's on pain of death. You can't just go to the king. You have to wait for him to call you. However, following Mordecai's insistent prodding, she resolves to do what she can to save her people. And this famous passage, "After that I will go to the king, even though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Any contemporary parallels, perhaps, even in cinema, to the idea of a young beauty queen being coached by a Mordecai type? Just thought I'd throw that in. It is the motif of a strong, powerful, dominant woman in her own right. If I perish, she says, having been egged on by Mordecai. The pliant and obedient Esther has become a woman of action, just like Sandra Bullock. And it's a real shift in character at that exact moment. And so it is with the donut scene in the movie. That's the moment in the movie of the shift in character, and that's why I had us look at that. So Esther then appears unsummoned before the king, Ahasuerus, who not only doesn't kill her, but promises to grant her request. He will grant it, whatever it is. In a superb moment of understatement, Esther asks the king to a dinner party. The king, accompanied by Haman, attends Esther's banquet and again seeks to discover her request, which she once more deflects with an invitation to another dinner party. Only at the second dinner party, when the king is sufficiently beguiled by her charms, right, Esther makes his romantic attraction work in her favor. Only then does she reveal her true purpose, the unmasking of Haman and his plot. She reveals her identity as a Jew for the first time. The volatile king springs to the defense of the woman to whom he was indifferent 3 days earlier. Haman is now executed, and the Jews receive permission to defend themselves from their enemies, which they do with great success. The book ends with Mordecai elevated to the office of Grand Vizier and power concentrated in the hands of Esther. How remarkable is this? How feminist is this in this society that we assumed was so utterly patriarchal? Esther and her book have suffered much, we're told, at the hands of interpreters through the centuries. Though very popular among the Jewish people, it was one of the last books to be accepted into the canon of Holy Writ, accepted only because of its connection with the festival of Purim, to this day a Jewish festival. The Feast of Lots, because the word Pur is the lot, the lots that were to be cast to determine the time of the execution of the Jews. Now the tables are turned and their enemies are executed. The book has been taken to task for irreligiosity. God is not mentioned, and that's a big deal and a great point of discussion to this day in Jewish circles. Here's a book where the very name of God isn't mentioned. Maybe it's deliberately hidden, is an attempt to rationalize it. The only Jewish religious practice referred to in the book is fasting. Rabbis were troubled by Esther's failure to live as a Jew. She has sex and marries a Gentile, a non-Jew, lives in the Persian court, doesn't follow Jewish dietary laws. And Esther has been taken to task by both female and male commentators for her apparent willingness to participate in Persian harem customs. This is a harem. And of course, for all the bloodthirstiness. But it's argued, this is an issue, the criticisms don't grasp the true purpose of the book. Here is an angle by our author, and that means it's an issue. Authors don't just report factual information. They have purpose, they have an angle, they have some idea they're trying to get across. And this author is saying that the purpose of Esther is really to demonstrate to Jews living in exile that it's possible to achieve success in the country of one's exile without giving up one's identity as a Jew. That's the real purpose. So the author is saying, lighten up on all the criticisms. Recognize what the purpose is. You can achieve success and still be a Jew, even in exile. The book of Esther is similar to such books as Daniel or Tobit or the historical character Nehemiah. But the book of Esther is unique in two respects. Here's an additional part of the argument. First, the protagonist is a woman. That makes it unique. Mordecai is, of course, the other leading character and finishes the story, but with a high rank. But this is basically because of his relationship to and through the efforts of Esther. This choice of a female hero serves an important function in the story. Women were, in the world of the Persian dispersion, the diaspora, essentially powerless, marginalized. Even if they belonged to the dominant culture, they could not simply reach out and grasp power, as a man could. Whatever power they could obtain was earned through the manipulation of the public holders of power, men. So the successful woman had to learn how to manipulate men in the midst of a patriarchal culture. And to that extent, could you call this a subversive angle? Esther is a subversive character in Persian society. So the exiled Jew could identify with the woman. He or she, too, was essentially powerless and marginalized. Power could be obtained only through one's wits and talents. But as the actions of Esther demonstrate, this can be done. By using her beauty, charm, political intelligence, and taking one well-placed risk, Esther saves her people, brings about the downfall of their enemy, elevates her kinsman to the highest position. Esther becomes the model for the Jew living in exile. The second unique aspect of Esther is the absence of any overt religious element. God isn't mentioned. No religious practice is observed. Only fasting. Many commentators have argued that religious beliefs, such as a belief in God's protection of the chosen people, are present. The argument may be valid, but it still is true that the presence of God is conspicuously absent. Jewish identity seems to be primarily ethnic, not religious. It is who Esther is that makes her Jewish, not her practices or beliefs. And that indicates the audience for the book was primarily in dispersion, in exile, the diaspora, where religious practices were just not possible. Ethnic identity, Jewish ethnic identity, was in danger of disappearing in the melting pot of the ancient Near East. So the book of Esther shows that this doesn't have to happen. Jews can thrive, even in exile. The character of Esther serves as a positive role model for Jewish women living in the diaspora. And the contemporaneous aspect of the message helps to account for the enduring popularity of the book and Esther herself in the Jewish community. Let's move on. Consider the text itself and ask the question, without an overt mention of God, how should we understand this book? Okay, it did in the end make its way into the Bible, but maybe we should, on a literary level, think of it as a dark comedy or an episode of Who's the Boss? The queen, Vashti, refuses the command of the king. She's not chattel, but thereafter she's banished, and the king wants another queen, whereupon we have the Miss Persia contest. That's basically what's going on. The girl who is also known as Esther, aka Hadassah in Hebrew, lovely in form and features, it stresses this. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died, an adoption of sorts. But there's no mention of Mordecai's wife. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and trusted to Hegai, who was in charge of the harem. So is she really a wife? What was the status of a harem girl in those days? The girl pleased the king, won his favor. And the Hebrew text actually says that she was good in his eyes. Titav ba'enei hamelech, it says in the Hebrew. She was good in the eyes of the king. maybe a recognition that as far as men are concerned, it's the eyes that seem to predominate. Attraction is through what the male animal sees, not what he feels, not what he touches. In a sense, men are in fact the weaker sex, biblically speaking, for that reason. Women are more inclined to use their senses, their wits, even in choosing a partner. Men just driven by lust and by the eyes. And Esther knows this. She knows the system and she plays it beautifully. Before a girl's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for women. So we recognize the importance of beauty and cosmetics even in ancient society. Okay, she pleases him. He sets a royal crown on her head, makes her queen instead of Vashti. So this is the Persian equivalent of marriage, becoming part of the harem. King gives a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials, proclaims a holiday. The virgins are assembled. But Esther had kept secret her family background. And then into the story of Mordecai, who was sitting at the king's gate. King's officers who guarded the doorway became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated, found true, the two officials hanged, and all recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Also gave a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. She instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king without being summoned, the king has but one law: to be put to death. And then Esther's words reported to Mordecai, and he sends back an answer. Don't think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And then Esther replies to Mordecai. This is the decisive point, the moment of change in the book. Before, it's Mordecai who has narrative power. Now it's Esther. She says, with all power, go. She tells him what to do. Gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. And if I perish, I perish. I will go to the king, even though against the law. If I perish, I perish. And Mordecai carried out Esther's instructions. On the third day, Esther puts on her royal robes, stood in the inner court of the palace, king sitting on his royal throne. She's acting now decisively. Power is in her hands. He sees Esther standing in the court. Of course, he's pleased with her. So Esther approached and touched the tip of his scepter. What is it, Queen Esther? Queen Esther, what's your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given to you. Famous verse. Even up to half the kingdom. If it pleases the king, she replies, let the king gather together with Haman, come today to a banquet. She's basically ordering him what to do. A banquet. Of course, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. And she arranges a banquet. Bring Haman at once, the king said. And the banquet is held. They're drinking wine. Now, what's your petition? My petition request is this, she says, if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare. Haman went out that day happy and high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai, he was filled with rage. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet. While they're still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived, hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther prepared. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. Then he asks, what is your petition? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom. Same words exactly, even up to half the kingdom, building suspense. The author does a really good job here. Building suspense into it, and you're waiting. How will she respond? And again, with all due deference to the male emperor, if I have found favor, and if it pleases the king, this is my petition, and spare my people. Grant me my life, that's my petition. Spare my people, this is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. Xerxes asked Esther, who is he? Where is the man who dared to do such a thing? And then she identifies Haman. And Haman is terrified. King got up in rage. Haman, realizing the king already decided his fate, stays behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. She again has power. He's begging her. And the king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? They covered Haman's face. Certain sexual overtones present here in Esther's accusation. Will he even molest the queen? And one of the eunuchs said, a gallows of 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. So they hanged Haman on the gallows, and the king's fury subsided. Same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, took off his signet ring, presented it to Mordecai. Esther, again pleased with the king, falling at his feet. The king extended the gold scepter. She rose and stood. If it pleases the king, if he regards me with favor, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman devised. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? Xerxes replied to Esther, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther. They hang him on the gallows. to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar. And they continued the celebration they had begun. For Haman had plotted against the Jews, but when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders. Because of everything written in this letter and because of what they had seen and what happened to them, the Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation. So Queen Esther wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter concerning Purim, again displaying the narrative power that Esther has in her own hands. And letters are sent to 127 provinces to establish these days of Purim. Esther's decree confirmed the regulations. It's written in the records. So let it be written.